Welcome back to DC EKG, where we diagnose DC's policy diseases and prescribe needed solutions. Today, we're thrilled to welcome a very special guest, Justin Shubow, who's been on the show before. He's the president of the National Civic Art Society, a nonprofit dedicated to championing the classical and humanistic tradition in public art and architecture in Washington, D.C. In addition to his role at the Society, Justin serves as the 11th chairman of the U.S. Commission of Fine Arts and independent. Are you served as the served as the 11th chairman of the U.S. Commission of Fine Arts, an independent federal agency responsible for ensuring the aesthetic integrity of our nation's capital. He's also the author of numerous articles and op-eds on architecture. Justin, thanks so much for coming back on the show.
Well, thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the new memorial in Washington, the most recent one, which is very striking. I saw it for the first time a few weeks ago. It's situated right out in front of the Willard Hotel, across the street from the Treasury Building and the White House complex. Why is this, and it's garnered a lot of attention. It's been attacked from some quarters, but it's been praised from others. What is different about this memorial from your perspective? Why is it engendering such passion, and why are you a fan of how it turned out?
Sure. So let me start by describing just what the memorial is. It's located in Pershing Park, which is a park at the northwest end of Pennsylvania Avenue, where the avenue meets the Treasury Department and ultimately goes on to the White House. It was constructed in what was a neglected, derelict, modernist park that, ultimately at times was an abandoned ice skating rink. The main feature of the memorial is the recently unveiled giant sculpture called Soldier's Journey by the sculptor Sabin Howard. It's a massive classical bronze, 58 feet wide. It's done in high relief with 38 realistic figures who are 7 to 8 feet tall. And the figures are assembled in diverse settings that all connect to each other. The sculptor has said that he's taken a cinematic approach to the work. He called it a movie in bronze, and it possesses, various different emotional effects and tempos. There is repose, there's rushing. Overall, it's an epic work that I think is a masterpiece and will be widely recognized as such. So, Sabin said that it's cinematic and it tells a story. So on the left, you see a soldier leaving the home front, saying goodbye to his wife and young daughter, who clearly don't want him to leave. Next, moving to the right, we see him and brave comrades in arms on the way to war, followed by the soldiers leaping from a trench with their rifles and bayonets, sort of screaming in some kind of battle cry. I think Sabin has called this entering the crucible of battle. And then we see the wreckage of the battlefield, which includes a distorted cross. Later, we see, either wounded or dead men. One of them is being held by a battlefield nurse or nurses, and it resembles Michelangelo's Pietà, that famous sculpture from the Renaissance in which Mary is holding the dead Christ. At the next part of the memorial, we see the carnage of war, more carnage of war, including a soldier who was perhaps blinded by gas. He covers his eyes, or maybe he doesn't want to look at what has happened. We really see the devastation of war. and the senselessness of it. The next figure is the only one who looks out at the viewer. He's standing all alone and perhaps represents a soldier suffering from shell shock. But it all is not lost. What we next see is an actual victory parade with the soldiers linked arm in arm, holding a flag. It represents America ascendant on the world stage. And finally, we see the soldier returning home with his daughter, holding his helmet out in front of her, and he's still holding his rifle. And according to Sabin, what this represents here is the soldier handing, handing things to the next generation, to the future, and ultimately handing World War II, what will to the people who will be in the next generation. I think the memorial is so effective because it is legible, meaning it is comprehensible to the average person. I mean, Sabin himself has said that great art can be understood by everyone, and memorials should be designed for we the people. It's a patriotic, incredibly ambitious work, and it evokes heroism, reverence, gratitude. It's not one of these modernist ink blots in which the design is left to the interpretation of the viewer. It's not a question mark, but a statement. I think there is, it contains various clear and unequivocal messages. And it's also timeless. It works today and will work in 100 years. And just to emphasize, it's not another minimalist monument or memorial. We're finally seeing a new work in Washington that is classical.
And Howard, he did the work. Not only was it his vision, but it was his hands, correct? I mean, his hands worked the sculptures that were ultimately cast. You can see his impressions from his fingers in the work, and you can see the actual touch of a human being as opposed to something that's just conceived and then printed with a machine or constructed by a machine. It's actually, you can see a human element to it, which I think is different than a lot of the ways that some of these other memorials have been done in the past. Is that fair?
Absolutely. I mean, it is true that Sabin used certain kinds of modern technology to, create the armature for the figures, to take photographs of, actors in various positions to study them. But ultimately, in the end, he built this memorial out of clay. And, I should say, Sabin is really in great shape physically. You got to be strong to do this, to be standing and working day after day. I mean, it took years to design this work. I know that he has a really strong exercise regimen, biking every morning. But yes, the way you described it, I mean, you can really see the human hand at work, and it actually, in certain places, Sabin intentionally left the evidence of the fact that this is something that's man-made. It's not 3D printed.
And I think he had to have it, if memory serves, he had to have it cast in England at a foundry in the Cotswold that could still cast sculptures of this size, because each panel is huge, and the whole work is across Pershing Square, not street to street, but it is a big piece that you look at and you can really stroll across it and gaze upon it and the different images on each panel. It's really quite a striking piece. So how did this happen? And how would you contrast? And how did the other ones happen? I mean, when I think of, I remember there was a rule you weren't supposed to be putting new construction, new monuments on the National Mall, and then there needs to be. Is it an act of Congress that that has to approve new monuments? And we've got the World War II Memorial, which is right there on the National Mall between the Lincoln and the Washington Memorial. It sort of breaks up the flow. There's the FDR Memorial, which is not on the direct line, but that's a huge monument. You've got the Martin Luther King Memorial, Eisenhower Memorial, which is over near the transportation. I believe that's a transportation building, and Korea, Vietnam. There's been a lot of memorials lately of varying degrees of quality. This World War I memorial, I would agree with you, is the most impressive of them. And it really sticks out because of that. How was this memorial so different than the other construction, both in design and I would say ultimately quality of execution?
So the memorial came about through an act of Congress, which authorized the creation of the World War I Centennial Commission to design and build it. The vice chairman of that commission is a guy named Edwin Fountain, and I think it is he who gets more credit than anyone else for getting a magnificent sculpture built, and not just get the wonderful art, but he got this memorial built relatively quickly and without too much controversy. And by contrast, numerous previous memorials have been highly controversial, and in some cases, like the Eisenhower Memorial, took 20 years to complete. Edwin had studied the errors that occurred from building some more recent memorials, especially that of the Eisenhower Memorial, which opened not too long ago. In the case of the Eisenhower Memorial, which was also authorized by Congress, they only held a closed competition for for a designer, and it was only open to professional architects, and it was essentially only invitation only. There were, I think, only 40 something entries in the competition. And by contrast, for other memorials, there have been hundreds and hundreds. And I think in the case of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, there was over 1,000 entries in a competition. This competition for the Eisenhower was also a portfolio based competition. In other words, it was based on the designer's, resume and their vision, but there was no actual design involved. Also, it was not blindly reviewed. And the winner of the competition was, Frank Gehry, one of the world's most famous architects, a so-called starchitect, who had never done a monument or memorial before. And many people thought that the fix was in for Gehry. At the very first meeting of the Eisenhower Memorial Commission's meeting, the chairman of the commission, who was friends with Gehry, said, "We need to get somebody like Frank Gehry to design the memorial." Ultimately, once Gehry unveiled his initial design for the memorial, a huge controversy ensued. And I think it's fair to say that my organization, the National Civic Art Society, really sparked that controversy that lasted for many years. I wrote a 150-page report complaining about everything from the process to the actual design itself, and it all our efforts and those of others ultimately led to Congress upholding all funding for the memorial for 4 years. and there was legislation to reboot it with a new competition that I testified in Congress in favor of. Um, the design itself is, ultimately did get built, but I think the controversy greatly improved it. The main feature is this enormous steel so-called tapestry. It's really a kind of scrim or fence depicting what is supposed to be Normandy Beach today at peacetime, but it's completely unrecognizable. It's sort of scribble scrabble, and the this tapestry is so big, it's over 400 feet long and 80 feet high. It's bigger than the Hollywood sign in Los Angeles, to give you a sense. The columns are 10 feet wide, not even columns, they're more like just pillars, just these raw cylinders. And in front of the tapestry are some stone blocks with statues representing Eisenhower, but really the statues are very poorly done and look a lot like stiff mannequins. Originally, the sole depiction of Eisenhower as a statue was going to portray him as a life-sized barefoot boy, 7 years old, like some kind of Tom Sawyer figure. And we exposed that, and ultimately that piece of the memorial was removed. I mean, there now is a statue of Eisenhower as a so-called young man, but that was a great improvement. And also, there were two so-called side panels in the memorial that were orthogonal to the main screen, and each of those side panels was bigger than a basketball field and would completely block the view to and from the Capitol. All this is a long way of saying that the memorial process was really terrible. We ended up with a very unfortunate design. And if you go there, you'll see that almost no one visits the memorial, even though it cost $180 million. So Edwin Fountain, who was overseeing the World War I memorial, he could see the errors of the Eisenhower Memorial. He did not want to hold a closed competition. He wanted to hold an open competition, one that was open to anybody, architects, sculptors, you name it. Also, one that would be blindly reviewed. He also recognized that the competition should not have been run, as in the case for the Eisenhower Memorial, by the General Services Administration. GSA is the federal agency that oversees the design of federal buildings and courthouses. It was never, its processes were never designed to handle monuments or memorials. GSA oversaw the terrible competition for the Eisenhower Memorial, but Edwin saw that he should not use GSA. And he also understood the importance of the competition brief. Any competition, design competition, is only as good as the brief and the jury. And in the case of the brief, I was in touch with Edwin, and I did, for one thing, encourage him not to use GSA to run the competition, but I also said that you need to insert the words valor and heroism in the competition brief, that those are values that the memorial must evoke. And in fact, the competition brief did talk about valor and heroism. The competition garnered over 300 entries, and I think many of them were excellent. There were some very good finalists, and ultimately we ended up with a fantastic design. And just to add to that, Edwin, he's kind of an old-fashioned guy. To give you a sense of where he was coming from, he told me that originally he wanted to have an inscription in the memorial quoting this famous line from an officer on the battlefield just as the soldiers are about to leap out of a trench. And the inscription would have read, "Come on, you sons of bitches, do you want to live forever?" And I told Edwin, you can't put that in a national memorial. I'm sorry.
I appreciate the sentiment, though. That's pretty funny. So, just briefly, the other memorials. I mean, if you look around to my untrained eye, you've got the Lincoln Memorial, which is obviously so imposing, and a beautiful sculpture of Lincoln. The Grant Memorial sculpture with flanked by the Union soldiers with the cannon, um, and the horses, which is kind of breathtaking. I mean, in front of the botanical gardens and the Capitol on the other end of the mall, you can walk around that sucker every time you're in DC and see something different. Just winding your way through, and they're beautiful. The Washington Memorial is fitting for its time in the obelisk and somewhat harkens back to a different era in memorials. I'm sure there are some people who would say, oh, it should have been a different tribute, but I'm not so sure it isn't perfect for who Washington was. But you get into these other ones, Eisenhower, like I said, FDR, the Martin Luther King, they don't seem as inspirational. They don't seem as fun to visit. They don't seem, and I'd say Korea and Vietnam as well. I mean, Vietnam was unveiled with a tremendous amount of excitement at the time when it was done, but it's a black slab with names on it with this sort of compromise of it's Frederick Hart, I think, did the other statue of the soldiers looking at the names. What went wrong with the other ones? Am I wrong to think that this World War One memorial stands out and is more closely linked with the Lincoln and Grant memorials, and the others are sort of a different sensibility and and the other one, I'd say it's not there, it's not on the mall, but on Roosevelt Island, the Teddy Roosevelt Memorial, which is somewhat crazy Stalinist imagery. I mean, if you just put Stalin's head on Roosevelt, you'd say, "Oh yeah, it's a statue." I mean, that's what it looks like. Am I crazy to think that the World War One stands with those other two, and the rest are in a different class?
Well, I think that, following the, say the Jefferson Memorial, which was completed in the 1940s and which, is a classical design based on the ancient Roman pantheon, there has been a general decline in the design of our monuments and memorials, and that is due to the hegemony of modernism in art and architecture. Modernism has always had a real difficulty with monuments. In fact, a famous critic named Lewis Mumford said in, I think, the 1930s, if it's modern, it can't be a monument, and if it's a monument, it can't be modern. Modernism has a hard time, doing valor and grandeur, designing works that are highly legible and understandable by ordinary people. I mean, Sabin Howard, the sculptor of the World War One memorial, has been very outspoken about the harms of modernist art. I mean, he said that the modernist art establishment treats the public in the same way that the government treats Americans. So we get all sorts of monuments and memorials in Washington that are not inspiring or do not have a clear statement. So you look at the recent Martin Luther King Memorial, which was designed by a Chinese sculptor who admitted that he didn't know anything about Martin Luther King. And he is a sculptor who had previously done many statues of Mao Zedong in China. The MLK statue is essentially socialist realist in design. And you could put it side by side with the sculptor's works of Mao and see the similarities. You can even see, if you look carefully, Martin Luther King is wearing much more of a Mao jacket than the kind of suit with slim lapels that he actually wore in the past. It's also some kind of, ersatz. He's coming out of a kind of like an ersatz Disneyland mountain, sort of a chess piece that has just been moved forward. It's also a largely secular memorial. The words God or Reverend don't appear a single time. And then you also look at another more recent memorial, the FDR, which is essentially an outdoor museum. It's a sprawling design that goes on for acres and acres. And the main statue of FDR is not heroic. It's him seated in a wheelchair, warts and all. I mean, he literally has warts on his face. His mouth is open. It is not a noble image. And next to him is his little cute dog, Fala, which is a work of kitsch. And what do people do? They get down close next to the dog, hold its ears, and take cutesy little photos. No one would ever think of doing something like that with the Lincoln Memorial, which has gravitas. So those are, some examples, I think, of, unfortunate memorials in Washington, D.C., but the World War I memorial shows a new direction. I mean, Saban has said he thinks that, he would like to think that this is the beginning of an American cultural renaissance. That what he has done is starting a new revival of classical art.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, that's an interesting observation, cultural observation, that I've heard mentioned in the context of, the aftermath of October 7th, and a lot of people waking up from Hamas attacking Israel and some of the outrageous protests we saw on college campuses, that we need to move on from the age of grievance to the age of heroism and valor. And maybe this does mark a return.
Well, Saban has said, at the dedication of the memorial, regarding his design, there are no victims here. They are all heroes. And to talk about heroism, it's kind of a foreign term in modern art. I mean, Maya Lin said of her design for the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, she explicitly said it's an anti-monument. I'm not denying the effectiveness of her design. I think it's highly therapeutic, and it is minimalist and bleak, which is arguably the right response for a war that was divisive and for many people was a mistake. But to give a more recent example of a lack of heroism where it absolutely needed to be, is the memorial for United Flight 93 in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. That was the airplane that was hijacked on September 11, and the passengers famously fought back, stormed the cockpit, after, purportedly saying, "Let's roll." They stopped the terrorists. I mean, the plane did crash in a field, but they stopped the terrorists from flying the plane into what was going to be one of the core buildings of government. I mean, what they did is up there with Paul Revere's Ride in its importance in American history. Yet, when you look at the memorial, there is nothing in it commemorating the heroism of those passengers. There's a wall with names inscribed of the people who died, but there's nothing evincing the heroism.
Wow, I didn't realize that. I hadn't been to Pennsylvania for that memorial. I guess I'll put it on the list. I mean, it was been on the list, but now it's on the list of a place I need to visit for a different reason than I thought. I was hoping that the memorial was going to be more attractive. Obviously, it's sacred ground, and I'd like to see it, and I'd like to show it to my kids and experience that with them. But that's a shame that memorial. There's another reason that the FDR one drives me crazy, which is that that's not what FDR wanted. FDR pointed out the window to, I can't remember who he pointed out the window to, but he said, I want a block right there with my name on it in front of the National Archives. And it's there. Ultimately, it was erected, a small block. That's all that the man himself wanted. It wasn't was it the Treasury Secretary he mentioned that to? I can't remember who he mentioned it to, but it's what FDR wanted. And then years go by and we decide, oh no, we need to create a huge field, cover up all this space and tell a story that I'm sure he would not have wanted that representation. Not just the space, not just the fact that it was done, but he didn't want to be represented in a wheelchair. He probably would have been appalled, as you said, about the idea of people taking cutesy. As much as he loved his dog, I doubt he would have been fired up about people taking cutesy dog photos with the Fala statue. And to me, it just seems a little bit of a betrayal for what he really wanted.
Yeah, I mean, it's an example of the plague of memorial sprawl. And another example of that is the Eisenhower Memorial. I mean, I was trying to give a sense of how big it is. It's 4 acres. It's so large that you could fit the Lincoln Memorial, the Jefferson Memorial, and the Washington Monument in it. And, yes, you're right. FDR said he didn't want a memorial any bigger than his desk. Eisenhower himself was a modest man who was buried in the same bare wooden coffin as the ordinary soldier. He didn't wear all of his medals on his uniform. And yet Frank Gehry, one of the flashiest, architects in the world, was selected to design a memorial for him. And it's completely out of scope and scale. And I think Eisenhower would have hated it.
Okay, let's move on because we've sort of done a little bit of a tour around the monuments of Washington, D.C., but let's talk about the city itself. I first got there in the 90s. Much of the city at that time was still not recovered from the 68 riots. You could walk from not far from the Capitol all the way to 14th Street with row upon row of townhouse that had become a shell, that had burned in the riots, that were beset by crime and criminal activity. And it was really, when after some new leadership came into play in Washington, D.C., but then September 11th came, that the city had an influx of money and development. The federal buildings have this sort of hodgepodge of beautiful buildings, say the Supreme Court, the White House, obviously, different styles of architecture, the Executive Office Building, which I was privileged to work in for a couple years. And then you have some absolutely atrocious buildings. The Humphrey Building, the HHS headquarters after Hubert Humphrey, which does inside have some beautiful quotes etched into the concrete, but it's riot proof, it's bleak, it's rotting, it's nasty. And the one I know drives you more nuts than anything, which is the Forrestal Building, the energy. I don't even know what the hell you call it. You call it a complex that's just acres of concrete and nastiness. It's so depressing over there. If you could be put in charge of all this, what would your vision be for what to do with Washington, D.C. to appreciate its federal role as the District of Columbia, the seat of federal power, but also a place where people live and work, and now is different than it was as first conceived. There's a lot of businesses in the area. It's a different city than it was in the 1960s, 70s, or certainly the 1800s. What does Justin think should happen with Washington, D.C.?
Well, that's a huge, huge question. I mean, I would go back to the very beginning of the city when Thomas Jefferson and George Washington consciously decided that the design of the urban plan by Pierre and L'Enfant and the core buildings of government would be classical in design. They looked back to Republican Rome and democratic Greece and saw that classical architecture was time honored and timeless. And they inaugurated a tradition of classical architecture that continued for 150 years, including, buildings like the Supreme Court, which were built in the quote unquote modern era. After World War II, however, we got this plague of ugly federal buildings, both in DC and around the country. Many of the worst ones are in the southwest quadrant, like the HHS headquarters, like HUD headquarters, or the Forrestal building that you just mentioned. And then also on Pennsylvania Avenue, we have the FBI building, also brutalist. I mean, when that opened, J. Edgar Hoover said it was like something from Mars. And as for the HHS building, I've heard that members of the cabinet under President Trump called it the Death Star. And people have joked that the only way it could ever come down is, via direct nuclear strike. I would love to see these brutalist buildings come down and replaced by, beautiful, beautiful buildings that ordinary people and government workers would appreciate it, buildings that would inspire Americans. And perhaps the place to start is with the Forrestal building. The building itself, for if you remember, a brutalist building with a bridge crossing over the north-south street. It's just south of the Smithsonian Castle, across from the National Mall. It's a really prime site. Nobody likes that building. It's not by a named architect. And what I would love to see is the building come down and it be the site of new Smithsonian museums. For better, for worse, there are always going to be museums coming down the pike. And two that were recently approved by Congress are a Women's History Museum and a Museum of the American Latino. The Smithsonian had announced that they want to put those museums right on the National Mall, very close to the Washington Monument in one case, and in the other, right on the tidal basin. These museums would take up important public space, block vistas, take away, green space. And I think a perfect place to put those buildings would be at the Forrestal site, which is enormous and has plenty of room for this. In fact, the National Civic Arts Society reached out to Catholic University's architecture school, proposing that their best students come up with a plan for how to use that site. And they not only came up with a beautiful vision, but they even came up with a bigger plan to take down not just the Forrestal buildings, but a row of brutalist buildings going all the way down to the waterfront. And what they proposed is creating space for new museums, monuments, memorials, mixed use buildings, to encourage people to live there, to eat there, and to ultimately connect the mall to the waterfront. Right now, there's no way to get there by foot. So that's an enormous plan. It would take real vision to get that constructed. But we got to think big. I mean, there's the great urban planner and architect Daniel Burnham, who designed Union Station in Washington. He famously said, "Make no small plans. They lacked they do not stir men's blood." And that's, one way in which we could see a beautified Washington, D.C. that continues the founders' vision for the city.
Do you so what do you think about the idea of mixed use in there? I mean, you mentioned mixed use. That's different. It is awfully lifeless. Whole sections of DC are lifeless after hours because there's no all the federal workers go home. Nobody lives near there. There are some cafeteria like restaurants, I suppose, in and around the federal buildings. Um, it would change the character, though, if you have people living around the federal buildings. Uh, but I suppose that would give it life 24/7, which would be positive. There's no reason necessarily why these buildings should be cordoned off, and the only creatures that are there at night are the rats.
Yeah, I mean, originally the Southwest Quadrant was a residential neighborhood. And I think it could be, the right place to have, both, federal office buildings or museums, but also the mixed use that we've been talking about to keep it alive at all times of day, to have restaurants, to have shops. Um, so yeah, I would like to see that.
The Humphrey building, my personal bugaboo for a second. I think if you describe its central characteristic, somebody says, why is it designed that way or why does it look like? The thing that I learned having worked there for a few years is it's riot proof. It's designed so that grappling hooks can't get into the ledges of the windows. And if people do break into the ground floor, I guess there's some riot psychology that you lock it down on the inside and the energy of the crowd goes away, which I think is a very bizarre vision for a federal building, that it's sort of like a moat or something in psychology of there are a class of American citizen in a federal building that may need to be protected from the other American citizens outside of it, rather than thinking we want an inviting space for people to visit and walk into and appreciate and be served, right? Isn't that what you would want from a federal building or from federal civil servants, not people working in it with their heads down and terrified that something they're going to do is going to provoke the wrath of the citizenry and they're going to charge the ramparts? Isn't that sort of a bizarre way to look at the federal government's role with the citizenry?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's a lot of symbolism in terms of how these buildings designed. Are they open to the public? Are they inviting, or are they foreboding, intimidating? You mentioned a moat. There is literally a moat around the FBI building. It seems inaccessible. It seems like an impenetrable fortress. By contrast, you look at the Capitol building and you have these steps leading upward. And the same thing for the Supreme Court. You get a sense that the people can ascend and enter these buildings. I mean, numerous Supreme Court justices, both appointed by Republican and Democrat presidents, have praised the Supreme Court steps. We should not take those for granted. It's an assembling space. It represents, the openness and invitation of democracy. By contrast, when you talk about buildings like the HHS headquarters or the HUD building, you get the exact opposite effect.
Right. What is that going to take? I mean, how long? I remember hearing GSA has like a lifespan on certain federal buildings. The FBI building is past its life, I believe, and there's talk of tearing it down, moving the FBI out of that space entirely, moving it to another state or the suburbs. And let's say everybody agreed, or the majority of people agreed, or that the Humphrey building needs to be destroyed and the Forest building needs to be destroyed, and we're going to do something wonderful and redevelop it. What would need to happen besides money getting appropriated?
Well, the FBI building is not that old. It was completed in the 1970s, and yet the fact that it's falling apart and is obsolete shows the failures of modernist architecture. Classically designed buildings made of masonry and with traditional construction techniques can last hundreds and hundreds of years. So here we have brutalist buildings already ending, at the end of their lifespan. I mean, yeah, it will take a lot of money to tear down buildings like that. I think it's going to cost hundreds of millions of dollars just to tear down the FBI headquarters. And it remains to be seen what will be built on that site. As you mentioned, there has been talk about moving the FBI to the suburbs. Right now, I think the selected site is in Maryland. But President Trump posted on Truth Social that he thinks the FBI should stay at its current site. And he had previously, at the end of his term, issued an amazing executive order calling for all new federal buildings in Washington to be classical. And if you imagine, I mean, Biden rescinded that order soon after taking office, but it's easy to imagine if Trump is reelected, he will reissue that executive order or something like it. And you combine that with his wish for the FBI to stay where it is, and we would end up with a new classical FBI building.
I misspoke during the intro when I said that you serve on the Fine Arts Commission. And of course, it's past tense. You served. You were appointed by President Trump and then summarily fired by President Biden. Normally, the Fine Arts Commission, is it my recollection, they roll off. People carry on for a period of time for the new president, and then they roll off and are replaced. You were fired with two other commissioners. Is that correct? Is my recollection right?
Three others.
Three
Out of
others.
A total of 7.
So why were you fired? And contrast that. So did Trump put all 7 on, or did he only put 4 on?
So the Fine Arts Commission was established in 1910 as the Aesthetic Review Board for Washington, D.C. It oversees the design of all monuments, memorials, public buildings, and so on. It was also created originally to steward the 1901 Senate McMillan Plan for Washington, D.C., which is what created the National Mall and the Monumental Core as we know it. The McMillan Plan essentially, finished L'Enfant's plan vision for the city and gave us, the Lincoln Memorial and the Smithsonian Museums, and the Fine Arts Commission was intended to, support that classical vision. However, ultimately, after World War II, the commission, which is made up of 7 presidential appointees who serve 4-year terms, became all modernist in orientation, and they approved all the terrible things in Washington that people can think of, including, say the Hirshhorn Museum, which to me reminds me of some kind of gun turret. The President Trump, as prior commissioners' terms ended, just waiting for their 4-year terms to end, one after the other appointed advocates for classical design to the commission. I was his first appointment, and then ultimately all 7 appointees were classicists. It represented a complete revolution. And I was elected chairman. And you have to understand, their chairman typically serve for a long period of time. I was only the 11th chairman since 1910. I mean, chairmen typically get reappointed, serving for well over 4 years. But the art and architectural establishment couldn't stand the fact that there were so many classicists on the Fine Arts Commission. They saw us as a real threat. Not that I think we did anything controversial at the time. I think there is nothing that people can point to that was controversial. but the fact that we were there was a problem. And soon, a couple months after taking office, President Biden removed me and three other commissioners. And the White House did openly say that we were removed since our support for classicism did not comport with the president's values. So I think that was very shocking because I think the outlook that we held really represented that of the American people. I mean, if you look, there's a survey of Americans in which the Harris poll found that 72% of the people surveyed preferred classical and traditional design for federal buildings and U.S. courthouses. The Fine Arts Commission represented the consensus of the American people, which is admittedly different than that of the art and architecture establishment, which is largely modernist. But, if you look in Biden's mind, is he opposed to classical and traditional art and architecture? I think probably not, but his staff and the establishment clearly got to him, which is why I and others were removed, even though no president had removed a commissioner in the commission's 110-year history.
Yeah, that's an important observation, the way that you and others were treated by this group. I would agree with you. I mean, I can't imagine a scenario where Biden was fretting about the idea of classical architectural sensibilities in designing or approving designs for federal buildings or monuments or having an advisory role in the way the Fine Arts Commission does. I mean, obviously somebody maneuvered inside the White House or around the White House to get you summarily fired, you and your colleagues. And to me, it was a really sad chapter to watch people get treated. It wasn't just among the Fine Arts Commission, but there were plenty of other non-political commissions that were just politicized in ways that, and with a level of vindictiveness that I thought was completely inappropriate. Justin, we're pretty much out of time. I mean, I could talk to you about architecture all day long because I learned something, and it is exciting to think about what could be done in the future. I think the idea of improving Washington, D.C., a city who I have a lot of affection for, and making it more pleasant to walk around, more pleasant for Americans to visit, but more pleasant to work in as well, is something that we should all support. And I want to thank you for all the work that you do to try and make D.C. And federal buildings more attractive and usable and functional. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Joe.
We want to thank our sponsor, Survivors for Solutions, our producer, Lauren Timmerman, and executive producer, John C.Z. Swartacki, as well as our distribution partner, Bigwig Media, and our production team, Evergreen. On behalf of DC EKG, this is Joe Grogan, along with Justin Shubow, who was our guest this week. Thanks so much for joining.
Thanks for having me.